Quay, Balbalian Nishnaabeg, Pikwaktagon and Nonjaba, Makuashid Mikanak Nindodem. Hello, my name is Belle Bailey. I'm an Algonquin from Pikwaktagon First Nation, and I belong to Turtle and Bear Clan. I would like to share with those in attendance today my own land acknowledgement. I am currently on the land of my ancestors, the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, in the capital of Ottawa, Ontario, on the banks of the Great Kitchissippi River. I would also like to acknowledge all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for the lands on Turtle Island since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of our communities and all communities across our country. Acknowledging traditional languages, traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize contemporary and historical Indigenous presence and land rights. It is a small step towards dismantling the continued impacts of colonialism and undoing Indigenous erasure in our everyday lives. We commit to continue to explore and make meaningful contributions to the calls to action that result from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I encourage everyone in attendance to think of the traditional Indigenous territory they are currently situated on, where they are watching from today. If you do not know what Indigenous territory you are currently residing on, I encourage you to research it farther to find out not only the names, but some of the history of these traditional territories. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Belle, for our land acknowledgement. So I'm Sabrina Anishnaabeg. I'm from Bearskin Lake First Nation in Treaty 9 territory, and I am joining you live from Tukaronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishnaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I am here to be having a conversation with Desiree Duplessis, but we are here because of Secret Path Week. So the Gord Downie and Cheney Wenjack Fund is inspired by a Cheney story and Gord's call to build a better Canada. The Gord Downie and Cheney Wenjack Fund aims to build a cultural understanding and create a path towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. DWF's work centers around improving the lives of Indigenous people by building awareness, education, and culture between all people. So like I said, this is Secret Path Week, so we are live every day this week at 10 a.m., 12 p.m., and at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. October 17th and October 22nd mark the dates that Gord Downie and Cheney Wenjack joined the spirit world. We call on people in the land that we call Canada to use Secret Path Week to answer Gord Downie's call to action to do something. This can be by creating reconciliations and furthering the conversation about the history of residential schools. So Secret Path Week, we have a bunch of DWF live sessions going on every single day. You can find more information about each session at downeywenjack.ca/DWF live. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and be sure to ask questions in the chat because there will be a Q&A after. And yeah, so I am here to introduce Desiree Duplessis. She is an Anishnaabekwe. Don't mind my cat Christmas. She's an Anishnaabekwe, originally from Robert Superior Treaty territory and a member of Netmizaaggamig Nishnaabeg in Northern Ontario. Please, Desiree, let me know if I pronounced that all right later on. She received a law degree from the University of New Brunswick Facility of Law in 2018 and has been with Aboriginal Legal Services, also known as ALS, in Toronto for 3 years. First as an articled student and then in the Gladue Program. Prior to working with ALS, Desiree worked with the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and piloted an Indigenous Service Hub program for community living Thunder Bay. She is particularly passionate about Indigenous criminal justice, missing and murdered Indigenous and two-spirited women, access to justice, and social assistance issues. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Desiree.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you so much. And thank you, Christmas, for that warm welcome.
He joins every meeting I have all the time. So
you chimed in at like a perfect time. It was really cute.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me for Secret Path Week. Desiree Indigenous Makwadodam Netmizaaggamig Nishnaabeg. My name is Desiree. I am Bear Clan from Netmizaaggamig Nishnaabeg in Northern Ontario. I currently also live in Toronto. I'm very, very grateful to be here, especially for Secret Path Week. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to chat a little bit about what I do for Aboriginal Legal Services. We are a not-for-profit organization that provides legal-related programming and culturally based justice alternatives for Indigenous people. Like Sabrina said, I've worked here for about 3 years, and I'm currently one of the managers of our Gladue Program. So what does this program do? Our Gladue Program provides Gladue reports to courts across Ontario to give background on an Indigenous offender's life and give context to a judge that helps determine a just and fit sentence for that person. A Gladue report explains the systemic and background factors, what we call Gladue factors, at play in a particular person's life and how their life experiences as an Indigenous person affected them being in front of the court. So because you're all part of a legacy school and participating in Secret Path Week, I know you're all very committed to learning about the effects of residential schools on this country. Residential schools, along with the child welfare system, the 60s scoop and the millennial scoop phenomena, and family experiences of racism and violence and drug and alcohol abuse are all examples of a Gladue factor. At the time a Gladue report is triggered, it is time for sentencing. The person before the court has already pled guilty or have been found guilty of their charges by the judge. It's important for me to mention here that our process is entirely voluntary for the offender. When somebody goes through the criminal justice system, it can often feel like they have no control or no say in what happens to them, no autonomy in that instance. And as you can imagine, that's very frustrating and that can be very overwhelming and very defeating. They are sort of at the mercy of the system in that moment. So for me, if somebody wants to waive their report, it's not enough for somebody to say just no thanks. If they do want to waive it, we make sure that that person is making an educated decision, and that means understanding the process and its consequences. And if they have all the information and still choose to step back, that's totally their choice. So this term, Gladue report, where did it come from? You might be surprised to hear that it came from a 1999 court case, well before all of your time, I'm sure, the Queen and Gladue. This case covered a lot of ground for Indigenous rights, especially at the time, but the basics are this. The Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in our country, said that Indigenous people were jailed at alarmingly higher rates than non-Indigenous people, nearly 9 times as often for the same types of crimes. Indigenous people also receive longer sentences on average than non-Indigenous people. The Supreme Court also said that judges had to follow what at that time were new amendments to the criminal code to consider all sanctions before considering jail for every offender, but especially for Indigenous offenders. So before the mid-90s, there were actually no rules that a judge had to follow when handing out sentences in criminal court. That was something that when I first learned, I could not believe it because I truly thought that criminal court was nothing but rules. And the mid-90s, though perhaps far off for you all, was not that long ago for myself and some of our other facilitators and teachers. So, excuse me, when it comes to serving jail time, you might be thinking, if you do the crime, you should do the time. We've heard that several times in lots of instances. I invite you to consider the relationship between trauma and crime. For Indigenous people, the unique brand of trauma, past and present, and both systemic and overt racism that we talked about are all underlying reasons for criminality. You might have also heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people. I really do think that this is true. We try to focus on addressing the root of the issues that drive criminality so that rehabilitation of the person can be real and an attainable goal. Jails were meant to be rehabilitative at first, but what they really do these days is harden someone's spirit and teach them to be better criminals, which is, of course, not what we want. Jail should be a last resort when it comes to sentencing. I invite you to consider why we punish people again with jail when they've been through a lot at that point already, and why we punish at all when we could help. So a Gladue report is grounded in Indigenous traditions. It is, at its heart, a storytelling tool. It's one of the only prepared documents that a judge will see in which the offender plays an active role. When we receive a request for a Gladue report, the file will be assigned to a Gladue writer, and the writer will then interview the offender themselves, first about the family background and ancestry, and then about their life circumstances to the point. The writer may also interview the offender's close social circle, and this often includes family and friends, but can also include people like social workers, doctors, teachers, and anyone else who might have insight into that person's behavior or life circumstances. We'll often use direct quotes from our interviews for both the offender and the family members to allow for them to tell to tell their own story in their own words. Our goal is to give the judge the clearest and fullest picture possible of the offender's experiences as an Indigenous person and what made them who they are today. These types of interviews can be tough, as you might imagine. We do talk about people's childhoods, home life, their time in school, any systemic issues that affected their families, and any notable event from their lives, good or bad, that shaped them into who they are. This is some pretty deep stuff, and it can sometimes be unpleasant, but it is necessary for our purposes. It is so important for us, because these conversations are so tough, that the offender understands the goal of the Gladue process and how it will benefit them ultimately. Part of our job is to first build a rapport with the people that we work with and to build their trust. And ultimately, we hope that will elicit some honesty in the report. One of the very most important parts of the Gladue report comes at the very end. Based on the person's life circumstances laid out in the report, recommendations for sentencing are provided by the Gladue writer to the judge that are geared to addressing that person's underlying issues. And I'll give you guys an example. Sometimes there is a clear correlation between the times when somebody drinks or uses drugs and the times that they get in trouble with the law. This might mean that the drug or alcohol use is a big factor as to why that person commits crimes in the first place. The personalized recommendations that we would provide to the court for this person will address that correlation in order to hopefully lessen their propensity to crime. We do have to ultimately address the underlying social issues first. The reasons that the recommendations are so important goes back to what we talked about earlier. We want to consider all options before a jail sentence. The more recommendations that we can provide the judge to show the person is willing to make a change, the more likely they are to adopt them. And so hopefully the judge, this means that the judge will sentence the person to getting help instead of jail, which is obviously what we want. So the very first Gladue report was written in 2001. Again, feels like eons ago. But since then, we've also added caseworker services to our repertoire. Our Gladue caseworkers assist other offenders in following up on the recommendations provided to the court. They can attend the person's sentencing hearing. They might answer questions from the judge. They can help make appointments. The caseworker can help fill out forms, attend to those appointments, and connect the person with cultural supports, and generally just support the person in getting the help that they need and fulfilling the court's sentence or recommendations. This is all a very broad overview of what I do with Aboriginal Legal Services, and so I will end on a positive note. I really do love my job. It is rewarding to help our people help themselves, to strengthen our community and see positive changes in people when sometimes they can't see positivity in themselves. We have had a lot of successes with people who have participated in the Gladue process. We've had folks successfully enroll and complete high school, receive help for drug and alcohol addiction, receive different kinds of counseling for, say, mental health or for grief. And we've had a lot of people reconnect with their culture through meetings with elders and cultural programming. So I'm very, very proud of that. I really appreciate everyone's time today, and I truly am excited to hear any questions that you might have. Chimigwech.
Thank you, Desiree. So we're going to ask some questions. There's one in the chat.
Sure.
Again, would like to tell everyone to drop your questions in the chat for Desiree, and anything you would like to ask, anything that surprised you, or yeah, we just want some connection and to build up some interesting content. Okay. So from Facebook, how many Gladue reports do you create annually? Do most people volunteer for reports to be created?
So I'll answer the second question first. I believe so. In terms of most people volunteering for reports to be created, I believe Lisa might mean people who are the subject of the reports. And yes, normally they do. We do have a conversation with that person at first to just kind of let them know the ins and outs of what's going on with the process. And more often than not, they are willing to participate. However, if they're not willing to participate, again, that is their choice. And we provide a letter to the court that says that. If, if the person doesn't want to participate in that moment, but perhaps later down the road, they're, in trouble with the court again, and they might need a Gladue report at that point, they're more than welcome to come back to us. Once you waive the right, it's not like it's waived forever. It's just like in that instance. Mm-hmm. Gladue reports created annually is a little bit tougher of a question because there are a few different. Gladue report is kind of an umbrella term that I used just to not be confusing for the classes. There are quite a few documents that we provide. Gladue reports are for matters where the sentence is 90 days or more in custody or jail. And Gladue letters are kind of a less detailed version of those reports, shorter in length and also a shorter time frame to make. And those are for folks who are facing less than 90 days. So I don't really have a number for how many that we create because there are quite a few, but I will say that I myself, before I got promoted to management, I have written about 30 for people in our community. Communities, multiple.
So I'm actually going to bring it to Miss Grant's grade 8 class at Westwood to see if they have any questions for you.
Great.
Hear us?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. I'll just come on here. It's hard to see. Oh, there we go. I'm Miss Grant. And this is my student Janessa, and she has a question for you.
Hi, Janessa.
What type of schooling do you have to do to get into that job?
Good question. So what I did first is an undergraduate degree. I went to Carleton University, and I think that was Miss Grant's grade 8 class. So I believe you have a few years to go before you consider college. But that is a 4-year university degree after high school. And then after that, I did 3 years at a law school. That was in New Brunswick, as Sabrina said. It's important for you guys to know as well that even if you go to university for something that's not law related, you can still go to law school. There is no type of degree that is any better or worse. You just need a bachelor's degree. But I think that is the mandatory the mandatory requirement for this position is a Juris Doctor, which is the law degree. That's what we call a law degree.
Mm-hmm. So do you find it often that like people don't know about Gladue Court or the Gladue process in general?
Yes, and that was why one of the reasons I was very eager when you guys asked me to do this presentation is because that's one of the things I noticed probably first and foremost when I got into this work is how few folks know not even just the ins and outs, but even the basics of Gladue. For example, it's not just folks in the community. There are a lot of people within the legal field, including lawyers and judges, who are not totally familiar. So that was my intention in terms of coming on here and hoping to spread a little knowledge.
So since you said like not a lot of lawyers or people that work in the field aren't familiar with Gladue, how do you find it often that certain lawyers will not, or will certain lawyers or say when I believe when you're in court, you have paralegals and other people that you can like ask questions. Do you find it often that they know, at least?
Yes and no. It kind of does depend on where you did your schooling and where you're from. So perhaps if you're from somewhere that has a fairly populous Indigenous population, or from somewhere that is nearby, reserves or things like that, you might be more likely to know about those kinds of things if you work with them. That being said, even though Gladue came out kind of as a concept in 1999, the law really does move at a glacial pace, and it takes a long time sometimes for us to adopt new things. And so those people they do tend to know, and it definitely is important for lawyers to know. I believe that some of the Gladue stuff and some Indigenous criminal justice information in general could be used in the future for like public legal education for lawyers or anybody else who's just interested in learning.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely don't fault anybody for not knowing. I'm more the merrier to teach.
Yeah, like the only reason I know is because I grew up in Thunder Bay, and there's a high population of Indigenous culture or Indigenous peoples. And I also did a lot of work with systemic racism and the Anti-Racism Doctorate of Ontario. So that's probably the only reason I know about Gladue and Gladue Court. Mm-hmm. But a question from Elaine: when did law first fascinate you to pursue a career?
That's a good question. So when I first went to my undergrad, I applied to school for an English literature degree and quickly realized that was not for me. Even though I did ultimately finish my undergrad in legal studies and psychology, I didn't kind of decide to go to law school and really pursue that as my career until the year after. I was working in my community in Netmizaaggamig Nishnaabeg at the primary school there. Hi, Netmizaaggamig. I was working with them, and I really was interested in seeing how some of the unfortunate social dysfunction on the reserve was affecting the children in the school. And it was really at that point that I thought I wanted to do something. And then I thought, boom, I have all this legal knowledge. Why don't I go into law and try to see what I can do about that? And so it's kind of become me learning as much as I can by myself and doing things like this to sort of spread the knowledge and try my best to help everybody learn when, I didn't really have that for myself.
Makes sense. Okay. So another question from Natalie: what main changes are you hoping to see in the future for legal services? What are your suggestions for resources for people just starting to look into learning more about Indigenous law?
That's really excellent. So the main changes I'm hoping to see in the future for legal services, I think things are a lot different now since the COVID-19 pandemic. We used to be, like most places, a totally in-person agency. where you had to come in to complete an intake with us. But these days we are working a hybrid model. And so I do think that the future of legal services is going to be a lot more remote. And I think that the net that people are going to be able to cast in terms of what and where they are able to provide those services are going to be a lot wider. In terms of the kind of information that I provided, what I really do hope to see are more people approaching the Gladue process with the mindset that it is a right. It is codified in the criminal code that special consideration needs to be given to Indigenous offenders when it comes to sentencing. However, the Gladue report itself is not actually codified. So there's no piece of law that says, if this, then Gladue report. It really is up to the lawyers and each individual case to kind of bring up that person's indigeneity and the possibility of a Gladue report, and for that lawyer to request it. So I guess maybe a more streamlined process for that would be something that I would be looking forward to, where it is more of a trigger so that we don't have people falling through the cracks if somebody's not aware maybe that Gladue is an option for them. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going for the second question here. Suggestions for resources. The suggestion that I'm going to give off the top is our website, aboriginallegal.ca. There is a whole tab on Gladue, and you can take a look at the form that we use the form that lawyers use to request the reports from us. And there's a lot of information on that website that kind of gets into the nitty gritty of when we might provide a report or when we might provide one of those other documents that I had mentioned. And if you guys are interested, you can go take a look at that. I would also suggest Steps to Justice is a really good website for legal information overall. And it really is, it's built for the average person. And so it's not full of legalese. You don't have to be a big time lawyer or anything like that to read it. It's for the basic understanding. And that's where I would suggest starting.
A question I had was, how long is the process? Is it any different than a normal court process, or is it because I know you have to do the reports and all that, so I was just wondering, is there a different time frame with Gladue?
Yes and no. So I mentioned in my little speech that the Gladue process comes into play when somebody has already been found guilty or has pled guilty to their charges. So whatever happens before that doesn't really, not that it doesn't concern us, but we're not part of that yet. We're not brought in. So that part of that part of the law can also take a really, really long time. When it does come to us, if we are asked for a Gladue report, it normally takes about 7 to 8 weeks to complete, because there are so many interviews to be completed and so much research to be done. And then I also mentioned Gladue letters, where the sentencing position is maybe a little lower and it's a little less detailed. Those take about 4 to 5 weeks. Some folks might think that that's a really long time, but each one of our writers carries anywhere from like 3 to 10 files at a given time. So you're never just working on one person. You do have to balance and juggle quite a few people at the same time. Mm-hmm. And of course, like anything, if you make appointments or you make scheduling, you try to make scheduling changes, not everything will work out. And so you kind of want to give yourself that time to be able to reach that person. Something else that's a little bit more important in that situation is where the folks that we're working with have work in the day. We really don't want to get in the way of anybody's employment. That's one of the things that the judge is going to look at in seeing how that person functions in the community, is whether they can keep employment. So we don't want to mess with that. In that case, we might have interviews with somebody in the evening as opposed to the business hours during the day. And, if somebody works, it might take a little longer, but those timeframes are the standard in what we work in.
Okay. Yeah. Like, I know, like, the legal system too, like it is like a pretty lengthy process.
Definitely.
So you said 6 to 8 or 4 to 6?
So for a full Gladue report, it's about 7 to 8 weeks.
7 to 8 weeks. That really isn't. That's pretty average for like, I feel like, the legal system. And
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
If you consider how many people are on a judge's docket in any given day, like if you sit in court, you can see a judge go through like 20 or more cases in one day. And so they have tons of people to be scheduling. Eight weeks is like 2 months, right? That is not long in the grand scheme of the way that the legal system works. For sure.
Yeah. So we're going to go to another question in the chat. Who has been some of your mentors? Oh my God. Who have some of your mentors been in Indigenous law?
Great. Wow. It's it's funny that you say that because I work with them. Before I started here with Aboriginal Legal Services, I had been following the careers of some of the folks that I work with because they're such giants in our field. For example, Jonathan Rudin is our program director here at Aboriginal Legal Services. He founded us. He also argued the case in the 1999 case, the Queen and Gladue. And so he is a large reason why Gladue reports were created and a huge reason why this agency is who we are today. I also really admire Krista Bigcanoe and Caitlin Casper in their work. Krista Bigcanoe is our legal advocacy director here at the clinic, and Caitlin Casper is our senior staff lawyer here. I really admire them because of the work that they do, particularly in inquest work and test litigation. And so right now, for example, we are attending, or we as an ALS in the grand scheme, are attending a few coroner's inquests up north in Thunder Bay for a few of the, I believe one was an overdose death and one was maybe a death in police custody of Indigenous folks. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about how we can prevent that in the future. They're really good with working with families. And the thing that I love most about all three of them is that they truly do believe in us and they really do foster Indigenous talent, and they work hard to make sure that we are a welcoming place for our clients.
That's awesome. Well, that's cool that you're working with the people that you looked up to. And
yeah, it's exciting. It really is exciting. When I left law school, in order to be licensed in Ontario, you have to article at an approved agency and then also write your bar exam. And so that was my plan at first. So that's why I ended up here articling. And I quickly found out that like practice was not for me. And I really was more in the policy aspect of it, more into that, and more into working with folks one-on-one. And it's still surreal sometimes when I walk by the office and there they are, these people that I used to read about in school. It's inspiring to be able to like learn from them. They really are giants in our field.
Yeah, that's incredible. So another question from Karan. How was your journey as an undergrad student in college?
That's a really good question. It was kind of tough, actually, at first. I am from a very small town up in Northern Ontario. It's probably not even a town. There's about 600 people to 1,000 people at any given time. And so when I moved to Ottawa to do my undergrad, it was a huge culture shock for me. Like the place that I'm from doesn't even have a stoplight. And so having, traffic lights and transit and all of these things that city, like if you're from a city, you might take that for granted, but I found that was crazy. It really hit me when I went to my first lecture at Carleton, and it was in a hall that held more people than were in my town. And so I really did feel like a super small fish in a big pond, but ultimately I got comfortable with the classes and comfortable with the people. And it did help me. My undergrad was more about gaining my confidence in myself and the way that I speak, and gaining the confidence to know and to pursue what I wanted to do. So I will say that I wasn't as deeply entrenched in this field as I wasn't as deeply entrenched in this field then as I am now. But a lot of the things that I did learn were how to bring that knowledge out and how to execute this information in a good way.
For sure. I also have a question. What are your, I don't know if you've heard about those 3 Indigenous law students who are just about to graduate, but they can't graduate unless they do the oath to the king, but they're refusing because obviously they're Indigenous. And what are your thoughts and reviews? Have you heard about that? It's out in Alberta.
I haven't heard about that expressly, but I definitely have heard of similar instances. One that I can think of specifically is where a friend of mine was, she really had to fight in order to wear her regalia to a graduation ceremony. And I don't think I would personally make the oath to the king, but I guess that's up to everybody individually and what they feel. I'm not going to say what I think other people should or should not do, just because it really is based on your own personal relationship with your identity and your relationship with this country. I do believe strongly that if you believe strongly that you should not do that, or that you should stick to your morals, if that's the way that you see it, then we definitely need to continue doing that, because we are still here for a reason.
Yeah,
we're resilient, we are strong, and we did not, we did not survive this long just taking it laying down.
Literally, yes, that is very well said. So we're just gonna wrap it up here. Thank you, Desiree, for joining us today. And thank you to our Youth Ambassador, Belle Bailey, for doing our land acknowledgement. And also a big thank you to the class and their question for Desiree. That was awesome. So as I mentioned before, we are broadcasting live every single day this week for Secret Path Week, every day at 10 a.m., 12 p.m., and at 2 p.m. If you would like to find a schedule about our DWF live sessions, you can go to downeywajack.ca/DWF live. To find the schedule, see who's coming on and doing sessions. It is going to be a huge week. We are very excited. This was the perfect start to the kickoff of Secret Path Week. There is going to be a survey drop down in the chat about today's program. Let us know what you thought. And yeah, again, thank you, Desiree.
Thank you so much for having me, especially on Secret Path Week. It's really excellent to be here, and I really appreciate everybody's questions and comments in the chat. And thank you to Mrs. Grant's class for the question. That was great.
Yeah.
Bon maki, everybody. Have a great day.